only person perhaps who is a newcomer in this.
Yeah, so Nahar is doing his PhD from TIS. Yeah, so Nahar will be able to speak much because I don't know much about him, except that I had a small talk with Madhushri yesterday. And, then she spoke. Yeah, that's how things happened. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I do my research under Professor Madhushri. So. Vinay, are we going to start now or we'll wait for?
Yes, sir. We would start at 16:05, like in the next 2 minutes.
All right.
So how are you doing, Manju?
Right.
You both are based in Delhi?
Yeah. Things are in our field, things are going from bad to worse. So just somehow managing to hold the baselines. That's about it. It's a pretty bad state, I think, especially, given now with the COVID also, they are really pushing a lot of policies and projects which can do damage, and can pretty much take things back to a few decades ago. So,
Vinay, is this streaming live? Have you started streaming it live?
Yes, almost. Yes, it started.
Almost.
Yeah, means the YouTube wala is getting connected and it might be started in the next 1 or 2 minutes.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Almost is an interesting usage for streaming live. We are getting there.
That's pretty much how it works.
I thought I'll just, before Manju could say anything more.
Yes, ma'am, it has started on YouTube just right now.
Manju, now you can say exactly what you want to say.
Okay, then we should start with a meeting. Many people are joining, would be seeing the video directly from the YouTube due to the restrictions on the bandwidth wala stuff. And let's start. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here this evening, and a very warm welcome to this meeting, which is titled on the environmental crime impact on the future. So myself, Vinay, I'm the coordinator for CCJ Forum, and I would be just briefing about what is CCJ Forum and about our moderator, Nahar Muhammed, sir. So CCJ Forum, the Center for Criminology and Justice Forum, is a student-led initiative and guided by the faculty of the Center for Criminology and Justice, School of Social Work, Tata Institute of Social Science, Mumbai, which aims at stimulating academic discussions and debates on issues related to criminal justice system through criminological human rights and rehabilitative perspective. That's about a very brief intro about CCJ Forum. And now we have a moderator, Nahar Muhammed, sir. So Nahar is a doctoral scholar in School of Habitat Studies, TIS Mumbai. He holds a master's in history from JNU and an MPhil in natural resource management from Indian Institute of Forest Management, Bhopal. He has around 15 years of professional experience in the area of tourism planning and sustainable tourism development. His works on tourism planning project spans across 15 of India's state government, developing policies, strategies, and action plans for developing tourism. His work has frequently included environmentally sensitive regions like protected areas and surrounding communities for a wide range of habitats and scale. Currently, he is a project management. He works for Ernst & Young's and heads the project management unit of Department of Tourism, Government of Odisha. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Vinay.
Welcome, sir.
And good evening to all of you. It's indeed a pleasure, an honor for me to be part of this platform. And so I was not familiar with this initiative, as Vinay was mentioning. Only yesterday I came to know about CCJ and all these activities. But within the shortest possible time, Vinay and his friends could actually, brief me about this initiative, how this initiative has evolved, etc., etc. So it is indeed a pleasure, and I thank CCJ Forum for giving me this opportunity. Now, coming straight to our topic or the discussion of today, Vinay, are there participants outside the institution? We do have others as well.
Yeah,
okay.
Few.
All right. So welcome all of you. So today's session, as you might have received from the communication, is on environmental crime and its impact on our future. That is the title of the presentation or the webinar today. And amongst us, we have two most accomplished scholars who've had years of experience of working, in this area across the country and perhaps outside the country also. And they, in fact, share a lot of similarities. I was just listening to them, and I had seen from some of the literature. So they belong to the same batch of TISS, I think, master's program. I think now Madam Asha Mukundant also said that she also belongs to the same batch. So three of them belonging to the same batch coming together. Secondly, they both work in the same organization, the Center for Policy Research. Thirdly, they share a lot of similarities in the areas of work as well. So I believe they work closely. There are some publications where both of them have shared hands together. So it's so wonderful having both of you with us. Of course, we will, get to listen to them. But before we get into that, let me, let me give you some housekeeping things. So for all the participants, may we request you to keep your mic on mute mode. Only when you have been to speak, kindly switch on your mic. That's number one. And we would, during the course of the talks, we would welcome questions, suggestions, comments, etc. For that, you may use the chat box, or if you want to have a direct questioning, you have the option of clicking onto that raise the hand button. And we have our team in the background who will be facilitating that. Subsequent to that, we have the panelist presentation. For each panelist, we are giving around 20 minutes each on whatever topic they would like to speak on. After that, of course, I will come into the picture. I'll give a concluding remarks. And of course, I will also try to share few things about my professional background and things perhaps would be relevant to today's meeting, which I understand. And following that, we have a Q&A session. So that's the broader framework of today's webinar. So with that background, let me invite our today's first speaker, Ms. Manju Menon. Before I hand over the forum to Ms. Menon, let me read out her brief background for us to understand her professional and other background. So Ms. Menon is a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research, where she undertakes research, writing, and community projects on areas like environmental justice and the politics of resource rights. She has been engaged with India's environmental laws and policies for over 2 decades and has also published on these topics widely. She co-edited Interests and the Environmental Crisis, a volume of papers by academics and activists on environmental policies that have borrowed economic definitions and principles. She has authored several book chapters, academic papers, and articles in the media. She has published several key reports on the state of India's environment impact assessment and environmental compliance, coastal regulation, forest governance, land use change, so on and so forth. With that background, may I invite Ms. Manju Menon to deliver her lecture. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to this seminar. And it's an interesting forum that the students have put together. So I'm doubly happy to speak both to the students of TIS and to an initiative that the students have put in themselves. And before I start, I must definitely say that the reason why Kanchi's and my profiles look the same or look more or less the same is because we have worked together since TIS on environmental issues. We have a very long-lasting friendship and partnership in that sense, both work and personally. And we always look upon our 2 years at TIS while we were doing our masters as an inspiration for all the work that we have continued to do since then. We had a very wonderful set of faculty. We had wonderful classmates with whom we debated and discussed a lot of these issues, because also, when we were on campus, environmental issues were still sort of brimming up. They were not as public issues as they are now. But on campus, we always discussed a lot of these issues, and a lot of our batchmates have actually gone on to take up environmental work at various levels, whether it's at the level of community work or it's at the level of policy making and things like that. So TIS has definitely had a major role to play in creating a lot of people working in the field of environmental politics and environmental management, both. So let me just start with some of the questions that you had sent to us on what we could, the areas that we could cover in this in these 20 minutes. So I want to start with, the title is important, I guess, because it says environmental crimes and the impact on our future. So, and it's I feel that the past, present, and future, time frames while speaking about lawmaking, which define what are crimes and what are not crimes, is actually particularly important in the case of environmental actions and violations. It's, we have such a long history while speaking about environmental laws and policies in India. We always have the burden of covering a long period of history, because many of the laws that we have today were actually present or created during the colonial times. And alongside with those laws, we also have a wide range of modern or post-independent laws and policies, which we have created, as we have dealt with issues of environment and economic matters in post-independent India. So there's always a very wide, time span that has to be dealt with while speaking about environmental laws and policies in India. The question of environmental actions or criminality or environmental crimes is so closely tied to these legal frameworks that we have either inherited from a colonial government, and as well as the ones that we have created while we have tried to find our place in the world as a newly independent state since post 1947. Because if one looks at the global environmental consciousness that sort of came to the fore in the 1960s in the West, in Europe and in the US. At that time, India was still a very young independent state and was still grappling with the impacts of colonization and the loss of resources, as well as having to deal with providing for a very large population in this part of the world. So there were a whole bunch of pushes and pulls that were taking place at that time, which is why our environmental laws and policies that were created, whether it's in the 60s, 70s, 80s, they have a particular sort of framing where they would like to describe or find ways of environmental protection without overly affecting the economic development paradigm, by giving us space for economic development, but at the same time trying to do environmental protection within that paradigm. And so, you see these tensions between environmental protection and economic development in all these laws and policies, both in terms of the text of the law as well as in terms of how they are implemented. So, while speaking about environment crimes, it's really important to understand this, this long period of, this long history of lawmaking with respect to environment and natural resources in India. And that should ideally take us to the discussions or to thinking about, when we try to define or when we try to identify environmental crimes, what are these laws that we are talking about? Who made these laws? In whose interests? And who is implementing and adjudicating on these laws? These questions are really crucial if one wants to actually understand the social, political, and economic dynamics around environmental crimes. Of course, environmental crimes do have a very severe impact on ecology and the environment in various ways. But I'm saying that along with understanding that, it is equally important to place it within a socio-political and economic context, which is clearly reflected in the laws and policies that India has. For example, the question of environmental crimes is very closely related to, or violations. I mean, environmental crimes and violations of law are very closely related to how we understand property regimes in India, for example. What is private property? What is public property? Whose property is more important than who else's? And the question of commons, which is what most environmental issues finally end up becoming issues of common property resources and how we'll manage them. So these are all legal frameworks that are completely caught up in India's colonial and post-colonial histories. And so it's really important to place environmental crimes within that broad context. I feel that broadly, I think most of the major organizations, environmental organizations, or whether it's at the international level or like the UN, or large organizations, NGOs that work on environmental issues, mostly recognize environmental crimes in 4 or 5 major areas. One is forests and biodiversity. So this would involve all kinds of issues related to forest logging, use of forest products in different areas of forests, whether it's reserve forests or protected areas and things like that. And biodiversity resources have become such a big issue because they are involved in the production of so many commodities that we use today. And so biodiversity, piracy and theft are very big aspects of biodiversity laws, which interface with environmental crimes. Then there's the question of there are big laws, there are major laws on pollution and occupational health, which are also the subject of study when it comes to environmental crimes. I mean, all of you must have followed, the issues of oil spills, like the one that just happened recently. And the Bhopal gas tragedy is an example that's known across the world. So pollution, the laws related to pollution and occupational health and the violations around those are an important aspect while talking about environmental crimes. Then there's an entire huge area of work and a huge body of scholarship that has gone into looking at wildlife-related environmental crimes. And this is something that has gained a lot of attention, especially because of the issues that the wildlife trade that has been ongoing in some regions of the world, whether it's Africa or whether it's Southeast Asia and things like that. So wildlife poaching, hunting, and trade is like a huge, field pretty much by itself. Then there's issues related to extraction, mining, fishing, and those kinds of aspects. And these again are, are legal frameworks that are not just prevalent in within, and they don't just operate within nation states, but which operate internationally. Like, for example, fishing practices in the EEZ, what is the economic zone? EEZ, the export economic zone. Yeah. And then, of course, there's a very new and growing, very rapidly growing field of area of work on climate crimes. This has to do with projects and companies and governments who have not put policies for climate change or to deal with climate change in place, or they have allowed corporations and large projects to go on despite having certain policies and laws in place within their countries. So there's a large body of work going on climate litigation and crimes. So if one looks at all of these together, it's quite clear that what makes the field of environmental crimes quite complicated to work on is that these are all regulated by different scales of legal frameworks. So in some fields, there are very clear international laws and policies on what are environmental crimes, and there are very, very clearly demarcated institutions and procedures for how those actions or violations should be dealt with. Whereas for other kinds of other categories of activities, there is not that much let's say the consensus, the global consensus or consensus of large regions are not necessarily very clear. And so in those kinds of areas, it obviously becomes difficult to deal with crimes that cut across national boundaries, that may involve regions, or that may involve trade relations between different countries. But all that apart, I feel that there are some really crucial, there are some very big challenges with respect to dealing with environmental crimes and violations, irrespective of how, despite the fact that it's difficult to clearly define these. Clearly, if one uses the legal frameworks that exist in countries, then it's possible to identify these. But one of the biggest factors that come in the way of recognizing environmental crimes or actions or violations is that these are undertaken in places where the regulatory eyes don't necessarily reach so easily. So it's not possible to see and record and report, as and when these actions are taking place. And it is the nature of environmental problems that if you don't report and record it soon enough, then it becomes difficult to gather evidence, identify who did what in that area and things like that later on. So one of the big challenges that has emerged with respect to environmental laws and enforcement, so that there is some effect of deterring negative actions that affect different people's lives and things like that. One of the factors is that we don't have enough institutions in place that can actually report and record these actions as and when they take place. And so we know from India's experience that, you have a court case that could probably start, and then it goes on for many years. And then, I mean, it's pretty much the problems that happen even with other, other areas of crime, where it's, the actions and the responses don't necessarily sort of match, and that creates its own problems. So that's one big area of work, but that's, I feel that is something, if we think about how to build creative institutions, or if we think about how to bring more and more communities or more and more private individuals into this process, it might still be possible to set up set up different kinds of creative institutional frameworks to deal with this. The more difficult and the more challenging problem is that of political economy. And this, I mean, it's so crucial to understand forms and have some recognition of the forms of political economy that we are dealing with while talking about environmental crimes. Like, if you see in most countries, legal frameworks related to environment particularly tend to be anti-poor. They tend to be anti-migrants. They tend to be anti-minorities. And so, it's not a level playing field for everyone when it comes to identifying what kinds of actions affect the environment, which is a public good for all of us. And if you look at, many countries, including, and it's completely false to think that European countries or Western countries don't have environmental problems. Actually, they basically parcel off their environmental problems to other countries. And like, for example, I mean, if you see the footprint of fossil fuel usage that Western countries have, then that's enough to recognize the fact that that particular form of development comes with having to create certain effects on the environment, which eventually affects everyone else. So I feel that, questions of legal ambiguities, institutional, problems, not having some institutions and them not working too well, these are all technical aspects which we can somehow deal with, provided we're willing to address the issue of political economy and how that affects the environment, and how that burdens certain groups of people much more than others, and may push them towards actions that have an effect on the environment, but they have no choice to do it because they have been pushed into that by the political economy that exists in those regions. So going to the legal frameworks itself, I feel that India has had specific, like the IPC, for example, has a particular aspect called public nuisance. It's been there for so long now. So public nuisance has been one of the formulations that has been used a lot to look at actions that affect other people, and it has been used a lot in environmental cases. Hello? Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So public nuisance is one of the aspects that's being used a lot in environmental work. And then, of course, since the 60s, we've had a whole range of environmental laws and policies that have defined what kinds of issues can be treated as violations and what kinds of actions are not. And we have increasingly gone towards the practice of dealing with civil liabilities rather than treating these actions as criminal actions, because as as all of you already probably know, as students of as students of criminology, the burden of proof is extremely high if you have to book someone under certain crimes. And so we have increasingly moved towards the tendency, towards the practice of looking at these as actions that require, that attract civil liabilities. And so we've moved more and more towards the practice of fines and penalties, injunctions, and compensations for people who are affected by these problems. I think I can stop here now, and if there are questions, I can take it up later.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ms. Menon. I think you've covered quite a lot of the topic in this. Of course, perhaps the time was limited for you to cover many other things. So moving ahead with our agenda, now we have the second speaker, Ms. Kanchi Kohli. Let me just briefly introduce her to you. So like I said, Ms. Kohli also works at the Center for Policy Research, and her areas of work are in the domain of environment, forest, and biodiversity governance. In her work, she explores the links between law, industrialization, and environmental justice. Her research interests also include the implementation of different biodiversity regulations in India. She also has authored various publications, research papers, and articles. And she co-edited with Ms. Menon on different publications. Since 2004, she coordinates the Information Dissemination Service on forest and wildlife cases in the Supreme Court of India. Her work also emphasizes the need for research and advocacy as essential to highlight aspects of regulatory design and how it influences ultimate outcomes related to livelihood and ecological security. With that background, let me invite Ms. Kohli to deliver her lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's good to be always back in a TIS forum talking to all of you. And thanks, Nahar, for actually just framing my name as differently, because it reminded me of the film Agnipat and the villain in that film called Kanchi. So I'm going to just try to behave like that get in that storytelling mode now with that with that introduction. So anyway, I think what Manju has done is really laid the the length and breadth of how environmental crimes should be viewed, and it's and also the scope of work that we all have to do in this aspect. Based on the topics that you all sent me, what I'll try and do is just build on what Manju has said, and maybe talk a little bit about the complexity of what constitutes an environmental crime in say in the forest governance or the grassroots forest governance point of view. And to do that, I thought I'll start with a particular scenario, almost a true story. And Manju would remember this because we were on the same trip together. And in this story, basically, is that we are in a protected area in a national park in central India, in Chhattisgarh. We're moving around. At the end of the trip in the park, we arrive at a spot where we see a lot of about 4 or 5 elephants that have been chained. Yeah, they've been chained and they're really wanting to break loose. These are wild elephants. They've been chained inside the forest. There are forest guards and rangers who are they're tending to them. The elephants are hurt. They're being balmed, they're being fed, but the elephants don't like being in chains. They're in the wild. They like being in the wild. So with that, we start talking to the forest guard and say, what are these elephants? Why are the wild elephants here? And the wild elephants are there because just the previous day, they had entered a village, and the villagers had got together and torched the elephants out. Yeah. So we have a situation that the elephants are tied in chains. The forest guards are, they were in a protected area. The forest guards are tending to them. They are there because the elephants were driven away from a village through real fire torches. Mashal leke unko bhagaya gaya tha. Now the same village is an extremely insecure village because very soon the same village is going to be relocated from that area because the area has been declared a tiger reserve. Yeah. And as we get talking to the forest department guys, we also realize, okay, why is it that the elephants are here? I mean, historically, what is the reason behind it? So he said, no, okay. Then we get talking and saying, the area around this forest, which is now a tiger reserve, is extremely intense mining. Yeah. So the elephant's migratory route has changed and has entered into this village, which is about to be relocated, and the area has become a tiger reserve. And as we go talking, we also realize that, talking to everybody, that the forest department local guards who are tending to the elephants, protecting the elephants from the villagers who had torched them out, say that, what do? We know that wild elephants should not be chained and kept in captivity. But if we let them go, they're likely to be killed, murdered, torched. But if we keep them here, wildlife groups have actually filed a case against us. Okay. Now, the reason I actually laid out this scenario is exactly to explore, in many ways, what Manju was also trying to say in terms of the political economy, the power imbalances, and many other factors like multiple legal frameworks that operate on the same area, and many other complexities that might come up when we start trying to understand what is an environmental crime in the current context and who is the criminal. Yeah. And so in this situation, what is the environmental crime, or who is the criminal? Is it the mining or the mining operations that has destroyed the forest and the villages around? Either the one-time, takeover of land, or is it the continued pollution by that mining operations that is the crime that we are trying to explore, because of which the elephants have had to move away and get into this area? Is it, if that's one kind, the other environmental crime is the flash mobbing of the elephants by the villagers an environmental crime? Yeah? Whether it is under law or otherwise. Yeah? Is that an environmental crime? Have the elephants actually indulged in environmental crimes by entering into the village? Are elephants the criminals? Yeah. Okay, we still don't have laws for non-human beings, but are elephants the criminals that they've landed up there? Is it the forest department that has protected the elephants, the criminal, and what their act is a crime? Or is the same forest department that is pushing people out of their villages, the criminal, and that act is a crime? Or in the end, is it the villagers who have probably, not these villages, but adjoining villages who have asserted once or continually against mining operations? Is their act a criminal act? so the first point I raised is the mining operation, the criminal act, or when you're actually protesting against that, that land use change or continued pollution, is your act criminal? It might not be an environmental crime, but there are acts of protest which land up looking or there could be a breach of law in that as well. Now, if exploring the idea of environmental crimes in the forest context and taking from what all Manju spoke about, the historicity and how certain situations have come to be, become very critical to actually just ponder about a few things that might happen when we are trying to dig deeper into the whole question of environmental crimes in forests or other contexts. For instance, if you take an action which may appear to be a crime, a crime in a forest, but otherwise has been legitimized by law. Yeah? So you might look at large-scale displacement of wildlife, illegal felling, large-scale illegal felling, 100 trees, 1,000 trees, 10 lakh trees. I mean, a lot of the tree movements today are actually talking about tree felling at scale. Countries like Indonesia talk about 1 million hectares of destruction of forests, when there are palm oil plantations or all those kinds of things. But in the Indian context, it's about, so whether it's displacement or allowing for a large highway to pass through a forest area, a very important wildlife area. These activities might appear to be environmental crimes or crimes against humanity, crimes against wildlife, but actually they are legitimized by law or they are legally allowed. So there are legal procedures in laws that we have that allow for the use of these areas for other uses, and that impact which happens on wildlife or the human beings living in the area doesn't necessarily constitute as an illegal act. It's not a crime. It's allowed by law. It's legitimate. Yeah, or rather, it's legal. May not be legitimate. It's legal. The second point I wanted to ponder about with all of you as well is that some actions are clearly criminal offenses under law. Yeah. So, for instance, the torching of elephants, wild elephants, it's actually harm against wildlife, which is a criminal offense under the Wildlife Protection Act. Yeah. So there are very clear actions which are, this interface between laws and forest areas. This often comes up. So, for instance, action can be taken against the villagers to torch the elephants. Similarly, illegally occupying land or a village in a protected areas after your rights have been settled might be a very clear, legitimate assertion by people, but under law, if the paperwork is done, it is an illegal act. So it's a crime. That is the second point to ponder. The third point that I wanted to just think through is basically about how laws and policies often allow existing bona fide historical uses. Sorry, is there okay? So how bona fide historical uses can be turned illegal through the use of law. Yeah. So if you are, or they can be, I mean, whether it's a displacement or anything like that, or for that matter, there is this particular case where in the same adjoining areas in Chhattisgarh, where you have clear historical uses which were recognized under one law to say that this is what you get as your community forest right, because you've been historically using this area. There is non-timber forest produce, there's livelihood dependence, communities can actually protect that. But the same law, interpretation of the same law or the subjective application of that same law, which is currently being legally contested, to say that no, your bona fide use of that area will come in the way of mining, which we need to legalize using another law. So how these processes, I mean, historical uses or including legal documents get delegitimized or overnight turn illegal because of the actions of the government. So this is the particular case of the Ghatbarra forest in Chhattisgarh, where community forest rights were granted to villages and taken back or cancelled when the law doesn't really allow for it, to say your use of that community forest right is coming in the way of mining, because the mining had to be accommodated in that area. So I mean, I just, this is actually a very, very interesting area of work, both to understand much more deeply. In fact, some of the questions I might have raised might clearly fit or not fit, but I flagged them because this would be something we could all think through together. But in terms of actually developing a body of work to even develop research around these kinds of questions, especially locating them in particular contexts, in particular areas, in particular geographies, as well as develop a body of work and develop a body of practice that could help with instances of environmental crimes. What do you do when these instances occur? Whether it is local, regional, national, or international scale. And these kinds of experiences and examples can actually inform, contribute to that body of work, both when it comes to research as well as the practice that we talk about. And I'm saying this because being TIS as an institute that kind of brings together both research and practice very closely, these would be points to explore. So I'll just end with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kohli. With that, I think the panelists have presented their talks. So now, for the benefit of all the participants, I will put an attempt to, conclude the major points which each of the speakers have shared with us. First of all, many thanks to both of you for giving us very deep insights on a very, very important topic. And this topic, holds a lot of relevance in today's Indian and even the global context. In the Indian context, mainly because we have, a newly proposed environmental impact assessment policy, etc. And there's a lot of debate happening around. Globally, of course, we have the challenges, including, climate change and pollution and all those things in front of us. So therefore, having a broader understanding about the topic and situating that topic in a particular context, which you have effectively done, is a very important thing. And I'm sure our participants would benefit a lot out of this. To give a brief, understanding about what Ms. Menon has shared with us. So she essentially have started, or she laid out a chronological advancement of this environmental, laws or environmental action. So she have, talked about the colonial India, how things have, the wildlife and other laws have come into force. And then subsequently he talked about the typology, what are the different types of environmental issues and crimes, and how it is being connected to each other. That part again she talked about. And then she brought into this important concept of political economy, wherein she said without understanding that larger political economy framework, because the context is quite important while she took the example of developed countries and developing countries where the developed countries conveniently sort of parcel of their obligations to developing countries. So these are very interesting examples which she highlighted. And she also had touched upon the importance of institutions, the legal framework, how these institutional actions actually results into certain policies, etc., etc. So yeah, so that was largely what her focus was on. And the second speaker very effectively have continued the narrative by taking a very interesting example from a protected area in India, from Chhattisgarh, where she actually applied these things, for a better understanding, where she questioned the concept of crime itself. What is exactly a crime can be looked differently, based on how you are going to look at it. So that was quite interesting. And then she also talked about how certain crimes are being legitimized by law. So certain crimes, for example, the mining example she said, is a crime itself, because it is actually destroying the natural resources of that area. However, there is a law which actually supports such crimes to happen. So that is something which we've found very interesting. Yeah, so largely this was what we learned from them. And I'm sure our participants would like to pose many questions. They would like to discuss certain things. So before that, I have been asked to briefly, share my work experience in this area, and also give a background to it. So as Vinay has introduced myself, so I did my master's from JNU in the history stream, modern Indian history to be very precise, where I undertook a research on so it was basically on environmental history, and I tried to look into one particular legislation called the Nilgiris Game and Fish Preservation Act of 1879. So this was the study which so that was apparently one of the oldest wildlife regulations or wildlife legislations that had happened in the Indian context, where I had looked into the politics, what was the role of the state, and all of a sudden, as you all indicated, so the so-called common resources have become suddenly a protected resource, and certain activities of resource extraction have become a crime. So these are things which we have understood from the colonial thing. So this is something which I have undertook as a research as part of my master's dissertation. Subsequent to that, I got into a practitioner's thing. I have been working in the area of tourism, largely protected area based tourism all across the country. So I worked in many protected areas where this so-called interesting concept of poachers turned protectors is a common terminology which we will come across quite often these days. It all have started in the case of Periyar Tiger Reserve. But subsequently, what I'm seeing off late, particularly because I work closely with forest departments and tourism departments, etc. And currently I'm in Odisha. So Odisha government is also, showcasing the local community who are living in the neighboring areas of protected areas, were very much part of that landscape otherwise. Because of this so-called legislations, all of a sudden, they've been branded as, poachers, criminals, whatsoever. And their act of, fishing for their own sustenance and livelihood have become a criminal act, because there are various legislations, including the Wildlife Protection Act, which come into force. And what is happening currently is, because there's a lot of interest amongst Indian visitors and other visitors to the protected areas. These protected areas have emerged as, destinations, tourist destinations. So in fact, my research is also onto that topic, where I'm trying to understand the the impact of protected areas in the well-being of local communities. And I'm studying this in the context of Similipal Tiger Reserve of Odisha. So there, in many places, like for example, in Chilika Lagoon of Odisha, what we are seeing is the fishermen who used to, go for fishing. They have been termed as poachers because, they were found catching birds, etc. Maybe for their own consumption, maybe for, for commercial reasons, whatever it may be. So they have been now showcased as, criminals in the past, but now they have been employed in some ecotourism facility somewhere and called as, protectors or something. And the government is trying to, showcase them as, the poor people there, because they are not understanding the whole dynamics behind it. So this is one aspect which I thought, I should bring into today's discussion. Yeah, so I think I'm not going to go much into this. So now I think we can open up for Q&A. So Vinay, do we have the questions in front of us?
Yes, sir. One of our co-participants, Shivangi, wanted to raise a question directly with the speakers. Shivangi, are you there?
Yes.
Yeah, please. Can you please raise your...
Good evening, speakers. Your inputs have been valuable. And I wanted to ask that I went to this Chandoli National Wildlife Sanctuary where it is in Raigad. There I found that an organization has taken up the role of educating the poachers. Poachers being the indigenous population of that area who had been hunting throughout history, that has been their cultural occupation, and who have been taught into the wrongs of poaching. The poaching issue mainly came up after the supply being low, but the demand from outside being high. These poachers with no alternative occupation took up this occupation mostly of supplying the wildlife animals' bodies, let's just say that. So do you think that the legislations, while making the environmental crimes morally civil and tax and fining the major violators of these acts, but making the indigenous population liable under criminal offenses, thus making it a more classist and casteist legislations with heavy-handedness on treating the indigenous population happening? What is your take on this?
Between you might, any one of you can.
I think you should, Nahar. It's about what is going on in and around protected areas.
No, maybe I'll come to that later. So your perspective, kindly share, and then yeah.
Manju, go ahead.
For me, a lot of these questions actually start with trying to understand who is, as Kanchi mentioned, power imbalances. Who is in a situation of power to decide which actions cause what kinds of harms to which people. I feel that that's an important an important framework with which to understand actions and their consequences in many of these cases, and particularly like in places like what you're mentioning. There are also histories of uses of resources to consider. I mean, in many places, there is, even though many of these laws have been in existence for several decades now, it is still not clear to people what kinds of issues, what kinds of actions are and are not allowed, for them. And I'm happy about the part where somebody is sort of trying to take the law to these people and make them understand what is written in the law, so that they can at least take take informed, they can at least decide whether to continue with certain actions or not in an informed way. I mean, that is actually in many ways the first step. And even if they are informed, unless we are willing to work with them to change their conditions, whether it is in terms of their own livelihoods, in terms of their own situations of poverty, or their employment or whatever, unless we're willing to work with them and try and look for alternatives and options, I feel that just simply trying to apply the law in these cases doesn't work. And actually, this is something that's been recognized all across even the conservation field, except for a few, maybe some groups who generally believe that humans are a terrible threat to wildlife and non-human populations everywhere, except for a few people who still hold that very radical view. Others have all mostly come around to accepting that in countries like ours, we cannot actually work on conservation or protecting wildlife without actually dealing with the questions of how human communities in these areas live and survive on natural resources.
Yeah, and just to add, I think, Manju, what you're saying is that to each context brings out, to understand each context, one would, it's important to really look at, even with respect to this particular, context and this particular law that we're talking about, the Wildlife Protection Act. A lot depends on who were the actors behind drafting that particular law. When was that law actually drafted and under what circumstances? And who are the actors that are actually applying that law currently in that place? So, because a lot of what goes into a law and gets out of a law is a political act. For instance, when does some active, hunting, when did hunting really become an illegal act? Or for that matter, when was one species that you might be consuming as food enters into the Wildlife Protection Act, and how, under what circumstances it comes in? So those become very interesting, kind of historically, if you look at the progression, it gives a very interesting insight into the question that you raised. Is it anti this or is it pro that? It gets interesting to look at it like that.
Absolutely. So to add to what you just mentioned, by taking the reference of my research during my master's, what had happened in the Nilgiris of those days was, the colonial Babus used to go to, the upper reaches of Nilgiris because of the kind of weather and the kind of setting that they have, which actually matches with, their home back in the UK or wherever. So, so in this process, what they've done, they have also started, practicing their habits like game hunting, for example, and also fishing, recreational fishing. And what we had seen from the historical records is they have eventually even introduced certain fish species like the New Zealand trouts. They have brought all the way from New Zealand and introduced in some of the water bodies of Nilgiris. And then they said, look, the Muduans and the Puliyars of the community who were inhabiting those areas, you said you cannot do fishing from now on. If you want to do fishing, you will have to pay certain fees to the government and you take license. So why they have been doing this, as you have rightly pointed out, the context and the actors of that particular time. So all these things we need to keep in mind while looking into the the introduction of the law and its further application thereafter. Yeah, so I think we can move on to the next question. Vinay?
So there's a question in the chat section by Priyanjali. So how to increase the deterrence for organizational offenders, or be it like individual offenders too? who would like to take that question?
Kanchi, you want to take it?
So organizational offenders, as in, I mean, corporations.
The corporations, yes.
Ha ha ha. This is, how do you, I mean, this, that is the political question of today's times. I mean, this is, we have a, not just with respect to environmental crimes, but crimes per se, and how when the institutions responsible for ensuring justice, or whether it's the courts or through regulatory institutions, when the institutions responsible for meting out the justice, they have to act responsibly. So one is, of course, the responsibility of the offender, right? That you expect. I actually don't really expect profit-making organizations to really go ahead and be not make profit, right? So they will do anything to make profit. But there are institutions responsible to ensure and regulate their activities, and in case of offense, take actions that creates deterrence. So unless and until those institutions responsible are meting out that justice, it is difficult. So we can continue to say that big offenders have to uphold rule of law. When they don't, the consequences have to be responded to. And if the institutions responsible are not, are actually becoming clean chit organizations, then it's not likely to lead to creating of deterrence. In fact, this is one of the biggest debates taking place with respect to the environment impact assessment notification today, where the question arises that if you actually normalize the process of post facto approvals or dealing with violations within the law, you keep giving an offender a chance to keep coming back and rectify, and keep saying that, okay, sorry, I did not take permissions before starting operations. It becomes like a normal activity. It becomes a routine thing rather than becoming deterrence. So I think that is the political question of our times, not just when it comes to environmental crimes, but generally what becomes crime and what does not become crime today.
Okay. So the next question is from Nikita. She's saying, as per NCRB data on environmental crime, Rajasthan tops the list under several acts. However, further investigation has suggested that most cases are against small players, whereas there aren't many cases against the big violators. Please elaborate.
Yeah, I think this is going back again to the same question. I mean, it relates to the earlier question also, that the crimes and offenses, environmental crimes and offenses, if you look at the national records, it actually reports the most number of cases on violations of the of forest laws and wildlife laws, and that clearly indicates that it is our system of recording and reporting crimes actually sees certain kinds of course the records are made up of information that is provided to them from the states. The national this national bureau is made up of information that comes from the states, but that clearly gives an indication of what is happening in the states. And it's quite uneven, the level of information gathering or the level of data that's collected at the state level. It's very seriously uneven, and so it becomes difficult to actually treat this national crime records bureau. It becomes, at least on environmental matters, it's quite difficult to take this record seriously, because it actually has many gaps, and it mostly relies on secondhand information that's provided from the states. And as you can see from the data itself, it's very skewed in terms of which kinds of laws are being implemented on whom, and who are identified as people engaged in environmental crimes, whereas you will not see any of these major organizational, as Priyanjali put it, organizational offenders. If you look at the state of the conditions around, we live in cities that are highly polluted. There are all kinds of all kinds of problems with respect to water and forests and things like that. But individuals actually don't have the capacity to cause environmental harm at such significant scales as we experience today. And yet, our way of identifying crimes is largely focused on individual actions, and that's how they get their numbers. So and it's actually as one of the first I think one of the first students who spoke, it is actually very racist and very classist and all of that stuff, because that is the kind of legacy that we share with all other legal forms as well in society. So I think having to create deterrence or try to stop certain kinds of actions and not target certain groups of people who are simply because they belong to certain socioeconomic classes. These kinds of reforms we need across the board, not just with environmental law and policy, but we definitely need it when it comes to implementation and adjudication on environmental actions.
Great. Nikita, I hope that answers your question. I think now we can take 2 more questions.
There is a question coming from YouTube by Aman.
Okay.
So I would mention it. It's related to judicial stuff. So I would read it out. Do you think the compromise, if there is any, with the independence of judiciary and especially NGT, National Green Tribunal, is leading to prejudice in matters concerning the protection of environment where the state is a party? I would say the PSUs and all. So is there a prejudice when all such cases comes up?
I think the prejudice generally is towards ease of doing business, towards economic activity. So whether it's a public sector undertaking, whether it's an individual, whether it's a large corporation, small corporation, institutions like the NGT are putting out orders or taking suo motu action today that is working towards, largely giving out judgments which are persuading, offenders to come into compliance rather than, shutdowns, closures. At max, there'll be large fines, which then get contested in the Supreme Court. So, I think I just wanted to extend what I was saying earlier about, institutions responsible. How seriously are we taking some of these, because often in our work, what we try and highlight is that when there is a breach of environmental law, when there is an act of pollution, when there is a fly ash, dump that gets, a fly ash pipeline that is breached or it's broken, there's an oil fire. This is not just a mere illegality. It has serious real-time consequences on people. And now, so if you treat it as a technical matter or a techno-legal matter, then you can say, okay, from tomorrow morning onwards, you plug it. Or, from day after, you pay this much fine. Or let's keep debating about it. But if you see it as real consequences on real people, on real geographies, then, how you respond to these situations has to be creating that deterrence rather than dealing with it as a, okay, gradually we need, in fact, there have been questions that have been raised and saying, we cannot shut down business. We cannot. Those are the kind of conversations, but it's okay if some of the impacts carry on. Gradually, we'll put them in order. So I think institutions are having to deal, or I think the bias very clearly is at that level as well.
Yeah, environmental law implementation is seriously constrained by just one aspect, which is that the implementation of environmental laws should not cause harm to the economy. So when that is the overarching constraint, then it sort of really affects the implementation across the board, and all institutions and regulatory bodies. And India has actually one of the most, a very wide range of institutions, agencies, departments. If you look at it, it's grown over time to such an extent. But despite that, there are severe constraints on how environmental law is implemented when it comes to these kinds of actors. I mean, large institutionalized actors who are engaged in economic activities.
All right. Vinay, can we take 2 more questions? I think we've got 2 more questions.
Yes, sir. So should I be reading out the question?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, so do India have a scope of green political parties similar to the US, UK, or New Zealand? And whether that the normal social movements or the environmental movements can be converted into a political organization or a party? Does India have a scope of such stuff, or is it happening in the background?
Yeah, I think in the last 10 years, there have been some efforts to mobilize, in terms of party politics, and to try and figure out if, there can be a number of environmental and green movements that can come together under it. It's although, I mean, there are efforts, and some, I mean, though I'm not completely familiar with who is behind these efforts and, what their ultimate goals are. But I feel that knowing Indian politics, it's quite difficult to actually, come up with this kind of formulation, because Indian politics now is largely run by big money. And so, and I think there's a very, very small intersection, where environmental issues and big money sort of come together. I mean, there may be some corporations who are now thinking about getting into, because there are these new areas that are opening up in a major way in India, like renewable energy or electric cars and things like that. So the intersections are all at those levels, but that's not necessarily enough to draw, the big resources that are needed to create a political platform, on environmental issues. And of course, I mean, several people from environmental movements have actually stood for elections in the past, if not to win, and because it's difficult to win without any major people backing you up, but at least to raise these issues, at a much larger level. So there have been many environmental people who have fought elections.
Connected to this, would like to ask, movements like Narmada Bachao Andolan, such civil led movements. Do you think any such movements have any relevance in today's India, or do we have any examples which you can cite?
Yeah. Social and environmental movements are the only platform which asks big questions of governments across the board without being overly partisan towards one or the other ideological formations. And in fact, I would say that if anyone's thinking about creating some kind of public deterrence against major environmental violations and crimes, it's actually only these social and environmental movements that can actually carry it, because governments, as we were talking, are severely constrained by how much they can push certain actors. But if we have a very active civil society and environmental and social because environmental and social movements also play the role of informing the public. They play the role of creating a certain kind of consciousness about rights and about about duties, which are actually really crucial. Even I mean, they are very crucial today, and one can see how important they are from the way governments are reacting to them. No? I mean, that's a big sign of what social and environmental movements can do. So I feel that one of the big ways in which deterrence can be created is at the level of society, which can be done through large social and environmental movements.
Right. Vinay,
So, yes,
I think there are two questions I could see in the chat box. So maybe with that
we can take the Shivangi's question as a final question. Is India ready to finally shed its colonial tones in legislation, but rather allow space for indigenous community-based policies? Is India ready?
And then she continues by saying, I'm from
Jharkhand.
500 plus MOUs have been signed, giving entry to private companies for quote unquote developmental processes in the forests, etc. How do you see the climate change debates unfolding on this front?
Okay.
Go ahead, Manju. Go ahead.
Well, I don't know. I don't know about shedding, a colonial legacy. I mean, I think it's I think we are quite decolonized still in how we approach our own citizens, and especially certain groups of people who live who depend completely on resources. I'm not sure. I mean, so yeah. So I don't necessarily think we are yet at that stage where we are shedding anything colonial. But clearly, I mean, there are major formations. I mean, since we were talking about political parties as well, I feel Jharkhand is a great example of how a mainstream political party representing the indigenous people of the state has actually made land and natural resources such a central part of their policies. And right now, I mean, it's one of the state governments, I think, that has challenged the central government's coal auctions, and stated that they've not agreed to it, and so the resources of the state are not available for central policies to just auction them off. So I feel that the politics in the state of Jharkhand seems to have definitely shifted quite a bit in terms of especially the land and environmental issues. I think the Pathalgadi movement was very important, to bring that on. How do you see climate change debates unfolding on this front? Kanchi, you want to talk about climate change and mining companies and MOUs?
Yeah, I really don't think climate change is really people speak in many of the mining areas at all. It's still a lot about survival. It's about assertion of basic human rights, environmental rights, resource rights. It's very much so the responses to, say, the 500 MOUs in Jharkhand, or even Jharkhand state's assertion on saying no to the kind of coal auctions that are going on. I think climate change is still, there might be certain people who are talking about climate change, whether it's activists or researchers and other people working with communities in these areas, but where already mined out areas and who are dealing with pollution, jobs, displacement issues, everyday accidents and risks. Climate change is really not on their mind right now. Also, the thing about where there are new greenfield areas, it's really insecurity, or it's also about how is it that this will pan out. One will we be able to actually secure areas or not? So a lot of it is still livelihoods at max. On some of the ecological argument has started entering. So or the cultural assertion argument has entered in these areas. But the interface, the climate change debate is still at a different level. It's still, I mean, in the COVID times, we have seen Twitter storms, etc., trying to, connect these two. But locally, it's not such a, the connections are not so strong. And I think that this is something, these conversations can happen in the future, because climate policies, or rather adaptation to climate change policies are now having impacts in these areas. So you're talking about plantations. So plantations are the new mining in many of these areas. So because you're not just contesting mining and loss of forest, you're also contesting what they're going to do with that loss of forest in other areas. So, and what that does to forest, right? So there are lots of areas of work that can be explored, seeing some of this, or a lot of support work that can be done with respect to climate change in mining areas.
Vinay, I think we are almost done with our time. So
yes, sir.
I personally feel we have to take that one question that's sitting in the chat box on individual actions, because that's one of the things that troubles most people who are concerned about the environment. So we should definitely talk about it.
It's an apt question to end the webinar also. So each one of us can carry some message while we go back, and maybe apply that in our everyday life also.
Yeah, because it's the question that creates the most amount of personal dissatisfaction, and makes you feel like you have compromised on your values, or it's the one that leaves you feeling unhappy most of the time. We find a lot of people around us, whether friends, family, and even activists, who want to be the personal message. They want to be the personal message through their own actions and how they live their lives. So, some of them have done it very well, in a very well balanced and in a way that you almost want to emulate. But some others have done it very badly. Like, for example, I think we've had friends, of course, many years ago, somebody who stopped drinking water and developed kidney stones. Then another person who completely got off certain kinds of foods and then ended up with some kind of nutritional imbalances. So these are, I mean, personal actions can also go very wrong sometimes. So it's really important to to deal with, I mean, to take up personal actions that that keep you healthy and strong and creative and all of that stuff. Because actually the one big thing that individuals can do is to organize and mobilize around some of these issues, and to also at various levels to ask these questions and to investigate these issues and these various categories and terms that are used in environmental discussions, to see how these apply to different groups of people very differently. And so, identifying those power imbalances and seeing, whose interests are being protected and whose interests are being sort of sacrificed is a really crucial part of environmental work. We've all, I mean, Kanchi, me, many others from our batch, all of us went through the phase of boycotting certain products, especially products made by MNCs. I remember, even while we were on TIS campus, there were big questions about whether we should allow a Nescafe coffee vending machine on campus. Should anyone be bringing Coke and Maggie into the into campus, all of that stuff. I mean, we've been through lots and lots of those discussions, even as students. And I feel that those are all really crucial, because they help you sort of discuss these issues. They help you gather information, about what these corporations are doing, what their histories are, and things like that. And also, to some extent, understanding the historical aspects of many of these large environmental organizations. I feel that many of them have very dark, pasts. And so it's really important to look into all that before deciding who you want to work with, whose mobilizing efforts you want to be a part of, whose campaign letters you want to sign. These are all very, very important, I feel, for a person who's concerned about the environment. And of course, one of the things that I always tell friends who want to donate, funds to NGOs or who want to take up certain kinds of activities, one of the things that we always tell them is try and do something locally rather than something very far away, because when it's local, you always have the ability to find out, what the dynamics are and how these activities to protect the environment or to oppose certain policies or projects, how that affects different groups of people. Kanchi, you want to say something about this?
No, I mean, this is going to be, I think, a question for all of us. You have to keep choosing your battles. I think that's what it is. At what point of time to, take. And I think just wanted to add in terms of, one is personal lifestyle choices, in terms of how much of public transport you want to use versus private transport. The other is also, and because you all are in TIS, and some of you are in this conversation also because you want to make those choices, I assume and I hope, is to, I think, even everything that we do, even otherwise, organize, as Manju was saying, organizing, participating in certain discussions, writing letters, helping people, all of that is actually individual action at one level. So one is the clothes I wear, the food I eat, calling out to which and mobilizing friends, families to say that you shouldn't do it. We've all done it. I've had wars in the house to say that there'll be no Coke in the house, kind of thing, and then given up after a point and say, I will not have Coke in the house, but you can do what you want. So those kind of things.
Plastic use is another one. All families have had fights about this.
So I think that is one thing about our individual lifestyle choices and our choice to actually try and convince others about it, which is, I think, a continuous thing, throughout. And the other is our choices to be involved in certain political action. So to support those choices, I think those are, we'll have to do it. In fact, you all might have actually seen the series called Story of Stuff. And Story of Stuff, if you see these videos, they started their entire campaign as individual action, understanding where my waste is going, etc. And after 5 or 6 of those series, they did one about the political action. Because say, okay, if I give up, if I recycle, where is all that dump going? It is actually going into another country. So then, then it's important for us to be involved in some of the political work or, the campaign work around it. So it's just that, yeah. And this can sound like a nice big lecture, but it isn't. I think it's a struggle as much for you all as it is for each one of us at this point of time. It's hot in Delhi. Should I put on the air conditioning or not?
So maybe one thing that might be in the minds of students could also be that if they were to choose something like this and they really want to do it, how lucrative it would be as a profession, in terms of jobs. Instead, ultimately, it also somewhere comes down to, if they want to do something like this, are there opportunities around?
Yeah, there's lots of opportunities now if I compare it with the kinds of choices we had when we were coming out of TIS. Now there are a lot more organizations at various levels, and there's a lot more sort of diversification of the field. So you'll find organizations working specifically on air pollution, or you'll have organizations particularly working on energy projects and policies in certain places. Then there's also the big field of ecology, wildlife, wildlife sciences and conservation, which has opened up to social sciences and legal studies. So there are many more choices in terms of job opportunities now. Yeah, and also I feel even to work individually, maybe there are interesting choices. Of course, I mean, it can be quite limiting to work as an individual because I feel that I mean these environmental work is great fun to work in teams, especially teams that comprise, you know, people of different generations, because there's like a huge difference in how young people, you know, look at environmental issues today and you know, versus seasoned activists and how they approach some of these issues. So it's interesting, but I think there are a lot more opportunities now, both you know, in the formal sector, like for example, you know, companies that want to shift more and more towards greener policies. Of course, in India, there are far fewer of them than in other countries, but I feel like even then there's a growing number now, and especially among startups and things like that. And the NGO sector, I feel even government. I mean, there are some interesting options coming up every now and then. But of course, I mean, within government, there's only that much that you can actually do if you're interested in, if you're a go-getter on environmental issues and things like that.
Yeah, I think in addition to these job opportunities, be it with private, public, government sector, there are a lot of these entrepreneurial opportunities are also evolving over a period of time. You know, just to give you an example, you know, there are young pass out from institutes like, you know, TISS or XLRA, etc. They have started companies like bike sharing.
Yeah.
So technology-based, environmentally conscious initiatives at the individual level, and there are a lot of support, you know, financial and other support one can get out of. So it is not that, you know, only focus on getting a job in you know, opportunity in an organization. One can also start something of their own. So that is another opportunity. So I think Professor Asha Mukundan, would you like to say something now, or can we close the session?
Yeah, I think we can close the session.
All right, great. So before we get into the formal vote of thanks, it's wonderful knowing each one of you, listening to you. I've gained a lot from this session, and of course, I would like to interact more offline, separately. So with that, I'm handing over the session to the organizers for the formal vote of thanks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kanchi ma'am. Thank you, Manju ma'am. Thank you, Nahar sir, for making it such a great and informative session. Myself, while reading about the same topic in the last 2 weeks, I became so interested that I came to a point thinking to change my MA thesis to environmental crime. However, it doesn't permit.
Yeah.
Also,
you can do it after.
Yeah, actually.
Do it after.
Don't give me heart attacks like this.
Well, it is so interesting, so rightly said. And I would like to also thank to Asha ma'am for guiding us throughout the process with the other faculties of the Center of Criminology and Justice. And also thank you to each member of CCJ Forum. And we also look forward to take such discussions forward to our classroom discussions. And this needs to be done in the future or in the present for sure. And that's all. So we call it a day, and thank you everyone again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.